The desk was covered with gray cloth and smelled of damp leather bindings and the sour smoke of torches. Thin strips of paper with reports of indecent rituals lay on the oak board next to lists of property and collateral, where stables, mills, chests of silver, and land under vines were noted in the margins. Rumors ran ahead of the summons, and it was convenient to write them down. Mills and chests did not need theological debate. They needed the key to the treasury. At the bottom of each sheet was the familiar formula about caring for the faith, and above it were threads of calculations, where the expenses of the court and the names of the commanderies converged. The clerk ran his fingernail along the line marked "Secret Meetings," and realized that this was not about the secrets of the soul, but about visible wealth, seeking justification for moving from one chest to another. A male voice greets the audience, asks them to write in the comments which cities they are watching from, and whether they have ever seen loud accusations cover up quiet confiscations, says that such stories help to distinguish myth from paper, and wishes them calm attention and pleasant listening. The clerk of the Royal Chancellery, a grown man with calloused fingers and neat handwriting, began with the most popular topic: rumors of indecency. They were eagerly repeated in the city corridors because they aroused curiosity, and curiosity blinded people to the lines in the financial registers. The rumors described improper kisses and secret signs, referring to nighttime rituals and strange initiation ceremonies. The clerk placed these words in the left column and neatly added the right column to them, with figures of debts, descriptions of pledges, and lists of the Crown's loan obligations to the order. The lines in the right column were monotonous and cold, sums transferred to the war effort. An inventory of silver in chests, rights to income from mills. A thread of design ran between the two columns. If enough dirt was collected in the left column, the debt could be written off on the right and property seized as a purification of the city. To complete the picture, he picked up the lists of chevaliers, adult warriors who conducted the order's affairs in the provinces, and saw the usual economic routine there: harvesting crops, repairing dams, barns, and bridges. This did not negate the secrecy and strict internal rules, but it showed that the secret meetings coexisted with seals on barrels and grain calculations. In the Crown's office, people whispered about another truth. The court was obliged to return what it had promised, and what it had promised had long since turned into a list of debts that weighed on the budget and threatened to break the treasury. The clerk opened the summary statements for several years, written out in full, and saw that the royal hand was reaching for the order's chests, not as sacrilege, but as a solution to the cash gap. When he added the sermon sheets on purity of faith to the folder, the picture came together. The louder the story of indecency became, the easier it was to justify the arrests of storerooms and the sealing of stables. He did not deny that in the world of adult men returning from war, there was a lack of rudeness and rituals that were not shown in public. But the paper required distinguishing between rumors suitable for the crowd and documents suitable for inventorying property. On the next sheet, lay the Treasury register, with a note about loans taken to cover the expenses of the war and the court. The lines contained amounts written out in words, and the names of the commanderies through which the payments were made. These records did not form a legend, but they did form an economy. Those who had contributed to the war yesterday became targets for purification today. The clerk noted another step in the mechanism. In the same weeks when indignation was growing in sermons, the number of empty bags in the office warehouses was increasing, and salaries were being delayed in the garrisons. People with swords and seals are always tempted to replace payments with arrests. He shifted his gaze to the copies of the interrogations and saw what legends almost never acknowledge. The confessions repeat the same formulas. The pages were filled with similar constructions with minor variations, as if they had been dictated from a cheat sheet, and the signs of indecency were stitched together from stable phrases visible to the crowd. He noted in the margins that these testimonies often appeared after the adult brother had been subjected to physical and psychological pressure, and that in the protocols, the surrounding domestic filth seemed more important than theological subtleties. The clerk deliberately did not describe bodily details. He recorded a social fact. Confessions were obtained by force, and the formulas in them were the same, because that is how the alarming bureaucratic machine works. It was precisely the stamp of uniformity that made it possible to combine rumors and property inventories. If many adults say the same words, then to the crowd, it sounds like the truth, and to the storekeeper, like the key to the chest. The next section contained lists of the order's property: mills on rivers, the right to collect duties, workshops, stables, millstones, and even copper boilers. The wealth was material, and did not fit well with the myth of internal debauchery. In the analysis of the economic books, adult managers emerged, people with boring professions who counted sacks of grain and measures of wine. Leafing through the inventories, the clerk saw how quickly such items passed into the hands of the crown after cleansing measures. It looked like a dry operation: an arrest warrant, a stamp, an inventory with a list of numbers, words, and signatures. He did not need to romanticize anyone's guilt or innocence. His task was to find the connection between the left column of rumors and the right column of the treasury. When he laid out the sermons on abomination and the debt registers side by side, an axis emerged. Myth provides the torch. Document provides the key. The crowd, tired of taxes and expensive wars, demanded a purification of faith, because that was what hope for order sounded like. The administration used this wave to turn moral anxiety into economic gain. The clerk added a note from the prison service doctor with dry lines about the consequences for adult detainees: fainting from exhaustion, marks from shackles, fevers in damp cells. There was nothing naturalistic about these pages, but they served as a reminder that confessions obtained under pressure were not revelations, but the product of the system. He also added to the case file charters that spoke of future orders, and the prohibition of repressive evidence. Documents from later years that reflected the anxiety of the century like a mirror. If the machine is allowed to collect money through dirty accusations, it will continue to work tomorrow. On the edge of the table lay a note with a list of the Crown's debts and the names of its creditors. Among them were the same names that appeared in the descriptions of the order's property. The clerk drew a line and came to a simple conclusion. Theology was a backdrop here, and the cash gap was the stage. He could see how future historians would write about debauched rituals and purification of the city, because it sounded good in the square. But the document remained stubborn. It showed a fiscal political takeover laid out on sheets of paper, like an accounting plan. And before the machine moved on, to identical confessions, to cries of purification, to confiscations, and to the search for new victims, the clerk left a note in the margins that was worth slowing down for. The myth tells of saints who judged debauched people. The paper speaks of a state that turns debtors into owners, and of a crowd that is shown dirt so that it does not count the bags. The clerk laid out 3 columns on a new sheet, as he was accustomed to doing when the hustle and bustle of the corridors threatened to break the thread of facts. On the left, rumors from the fairs about indecent rituals and secret oaths. In the middle, copies of royal orders for arrests and the sealing of storerooms. On the right, financial registers, where the amounts of the court's debts to the order were written out in words and sealed with neat marks. The picture was unfolding without embellishment. The thicker the tales of wickedness became, the denser the flow of papers to the treasurer, where lists of property awaited, mills, courtyards, rights to crossings, workshops, stables, chests. He saw how the spark jumped from market anxiety to clerical action. The crowd received stories about filth. The treasury received keys and seals. A male voice greets the audience again, asking them to briefly write in the comments which cities they are watching from, and whether they have encountered cases in chronicles or local legends where moral hysteria coincided with large-scale confiscations. He says that such notes help to compile a living map of myths and papers, and wishes everyone calm attention and pleasant listening. He moved closer. The summary statements of purchases for the war and the court over the past few years, recorded in words. They contained a dull heaviness, allowances paid to garrisons, expenses for re-equipping the mint, payments to moneylenders, arrears from cities. Next to them was a strip of debts with the names of the order's treasurers, grown men with the precision of craftsmen, accustomed to counting grain, wool, and silver. Irrecoverable debts, protracted wars, and the bad reputation of coinage with impurities turned the royal treasury into a quiet hotbed of fever. When he placed the order's income statements next to it, it became clear that it lived by a different logic. Strict accounting, stable flows from bridges and mills, cautious loans issued to the court. The order's wealth did not look like secret gold in the dungeons, but like a network of materials, stone buildings, iron mechanisms, notarial rights. It was easier to see such things under the cry of evil than under the write-off of old agreements. The clerk brought up the first interrogation reports. They were written by different hands in different places, but the formulas converged into a single pattern. Identical phrases about renouncing decency, secret signs, and shameful greetings. He noted at the edge of the page that the confessions came after long nights, as evidenced by the prison doctor's notes. Exhaustion, severe tremors, fainting spells, abrasions from iron. He deliberately did not describe the physical details. The task was not to interest the listener, but to show the clerical technology. Identical formulas were born where the will of an adult was broken by pressure. Identical formulas were convenient for those who had to present evidence to the crowd. The more uniform the lines, the easier it was to compile them into a brochure for the square and refer to the universality of guilt. On the next page, orders for inventory were piling up. An adult commissar with 2 witnesses and a clerk was assigned to each commturia. A stamped paper was presented, bags were counted, chests were opened, and inventories were rewritten. The phrases were repeated with the persistence of a blacksmith's hammer. The clerk saw how the word purification became a narrow corridor for dispassionate economic action. In some cases, there were complaints from workers about delayed wages. Decisions were imposed on them, where salaries were reduced to 0 because the property passed to the Crown in connection with the revelations. Thus, the anxiety of the crowd was converted into savings for the court. To check how synchronously myth and paper moved, he constructed a series of weeks written in words. In the week when the first arrests were announced, sermons about wickedness overshadowed the news about taxes. In the week when the first pamphlets with confessions were distributed, royal officials were already sealing storerooms. This was followed by a stage of interrogations for confirmation, and then an accelerated sale of part of the movable property to replenish current expenses. He came up with a short formula: rumor, confession under pressure, with a standardized text, inventory, transfer of rights. No one inside talked about faith as a path to truth. Each link served the mechanics of property transfer. At the same time, he filed excerpts from the city's medical records. They contained dry descriptions of adult detainees, fevers from dampness, skin inflammation, sleep disturbances, swelling from tight iron restraints. These lines did not seek evidence of debauchery. They painted a picture of the physiology of fear and broken will. For the clerk, this was important, not for the sake of pity. It was necessary in order to call the confession a productive result. When the will is broken, the text easily folds into a template, and a sample is the main tool of journalism needed by the crowd as an explanation of the world. When adults read identical confessions, they felt they had found the root of evil. When the treasurer read identical confessions, he saw that the cash gap could be closed. He added to the file a summary of debt disputes with other creditors, cities and foreign merchants. There, too, there were attempts to smother the financial conflict with a moral cloud. But none of those cases provided such a convenient justification for the total transfer of property as the case of the order whose wealth was visible throughout the country. Unlike scattered creditors, the order had warehouses, farms, water mechanisms, and its wealth could be imagined by any crowd as evil. The clerk acknowledged that in the collective imagination, this image worked better than any accounting calculation. Where society sees isolation and power, it willingly believes in a dirty secret. This pushed the investigation to follow a predetermined path. He encountered rare objections from adult canonists, who cautiously reminded him in the margins that confessions under torture were unreliable, and that uniformity of formulas was not a sign of truth. These notes looked like pebbles on a road where a cart had rushed by. The mechanics were already in place. The offices needed records of misconduct in order to file inventories based on them. He noted how quickly instructions appeared on the storage of confiscated seals and keys, as well as guidelines on the distribution of valuables between the court and the institution where state goods were kept. This was not language about purification, but about transportation and storage. Meanwhile, the crowd demanded purification of the faith. The clerk recorded in his notebook how the city's noise changed. At first, people whispered in drinking establishments, then gathered for sermons, then asked to set an example. From time to time, short fights broke out, and the guards noted in their reports that people flew into a rage at the mere mention of secret rites. This anger, mature and crude, allowed the rulers not to talk about delays in salaries and the heavy burden of taxes. In the square, they discussed not the treasury, but filth. And when the inventory of property was completed, the crowd was satisfied, no longer with words, but with the sight of seals on the gates. The clerk opened a folder with drafts of new charters being discussed for other nightly communities in the future. They contained formulas prohibiting the use of confessions obtained under physical coercion, stipulated the obligation to keep double registers of property and debts, and prescribed a procedure for external audits of statutes. He realized that even within the machine, an instinct for self-preservation had arisen. If no limits were placed on the tool of dirty confessions, tomorrow it would turn against any owner of a chest. This was not an awareness of guilt. It was an understanding of risk. He noted harshly in a footnote, "It is in the wake of the largest purges that rules prohibiting repressive evidence grow." At the end of this circle, he once again compared the whispers of indecency with the heavy gate of the inventory. The myth assured that the saints judged the debauched. The paper showed that the court served as an anchor to which the chests were pulled. Rumors painted fantasies for the crowd. Decrees outlined the routes of the convoys. The interrogation reports repeated the same pattern because confessions were made standard. Medical records spoke of the price of this standardization for adult bodies, and the charters of future years attempted to restrain the monster that so conveniently fed on the pornography of accusations. It was precisely this combination that the scribe was required to record, not for morality's sake, but so that years later, when the legend wanted to talk about filth again, someone would have a series of columns, rumors, orders, inventories, and a question that would sober up any crowd. Who benefits from the formulas being the same and the chests opening in one direction? The clerk returned to the summary notebook, where each interrogation had its own number, and each number had a set of identical words. He made short notes in the margins. Where the prison doctor recorded the exhaustion of adult detainees, where the guards noted sleepless nights, where the clerk signed the appointment of the commissioner for the inventory of the wine cellar and stables on the same day. The lines converged into a single narrow corridor, confessions that were easy to transfer from mouth to pen, and property that was easy to transfer from chest to treasury. He added to this correspondence with court theologians, which expressed cautious concern. The monotony of formulas destroys trust in the court. These letters did not prevent the wheels from turning, but they left a trace for future readers who might want to see the dry bones of procedure beneath the skin of legend. He raised the vault of the city treasury books. How quickly the signs at the gates changed. How rapidly the rights to collect tolls at the bridges were rewritten. How silently the keys to the granaries were handed over to adults in royal livery. The transition looked like a harvest count, without loud music, in the presence of witnesses, with the usual words about faith and purification in the background. He noted the dates, written in words, when the first decrees were sent out to sell part of the movable property to cover current expenses. The next day, the same books showed the amounts for the stallions sold, for the barrels of grain, for the tools from the workshops. At that time, the crowd was still discussing the secret signs, but the locks were already being changed in the warehouses, and the accountants, adults and silent, were sorting coins into treasury boxes. Further on in the folder were protocols from different cities where interrogations were conducted in parallel. The protocols seemed to be constructed according to a ready-made template. The same order of questions, the same hooks for indecent points, the same approach to oaths and signs. The clerk noted that different scribes, with different hand speeds and different schools, suddenly coincided, not only in their expressions, but also in the places where the pen lingered, as if they all obeyed the same invisible matrix. He did not try to portray this as a secret conspiracy of scribes. He called it what it was: administrative standardization that turned a living person into a line suitable for copying. It is this copyability that is convenient for the square, where repeated stories are loved, and for the treasury, where repeated procedures are loved. Next to them lay the guards' reports on the transfer of adult brothers between prisons and temporary detention centers. Each report contained the same information: a list of names, a note on their condition, and the signature of the escort. In some cases, previously admitted statements were corrected along the way to bring them into line with the general formula. The prison doctor recorded the dry consequences of these journeys: sleep deprivation, fever, edema. The clerk did not dwell on the physiology. He noted the fact. According to the machine's design, the confession was supposed to be a carbon copy, not evidence. Where the carbon copy did not match, it was corrected by repeating the questions until the match was satisfactory. He added sheets with notifications from the Episcopal Curias to this pile. Some curias, mature and cautious in their wording, asked to distinguish between theological dispute and economic measures. Sometimes there was a request not to confuse disciplinary violations with dogmatic judgment. These notes looked like an attempt to shield the heated air of the square. If one admits that the monotony of the formulas is a manufacturing defect, one must also admit that the basis for the seizure was not a conviction in the truth, but convenience. The clerk noted how such letters quickly cooled in office cabinets, giving way to invoices and transport registers. To whom, when, how many barrels, which lock was replaced, whose seal was on the gate. He was also interested in the reverse flow, how the myth reinforced itself. One day, he received a stack of leaflets printed for reading at temples. In them, dirty episodes took center stage. Not for science, but for excitement. There were no references to debt amounts or mortgage records. There was the heat that the crowd needed, so as not to think about the minting of coins with impurities and the delay in paying the garrison's salaries. The leaflets copied the same phrases from each other, and this helped the office. When the world repeats the same image, it is easier to attach any economic measure to it and call it purification. By the middle of the compilation, the clerk had reached the main hub, the spotlight of confessions, where people were driven to obtain a unified set of words. He noted how quickly repetitions and self-corrections appeared in the cases, on which the progress of the inventory depended. The closer the city came to completing the arrests, the more often formulas were found that fit perfectly into the brochures. At that time, the Treasury was already rewriting the registers of rights, and the courts, where indecent items were mentioned, considered property claims to be a mere formality. The system worked like a watermill. While the crowd watches the waves, the gears grind the grain into flour. Another folder contained drafts of future regulations for other nightly communities. These drafts reflected the fear of the machine itself. Tomorrow, any institution with keys and warehouses could take the place of today's order. There were stingy formulas that prohibited the acceptance of confessions obtained under physical pressure and required the duplication of financial books in independent locations, so that any seizure would have a mirror trace and convenient gaps in the records would disappear. Mandatory control over those who write protocols was prescribed, as well as a ban on model answers that were identical in different cities. The clerk saw this not as repentance, but as pure caution on the part of the authorities. If barrier posts are not put up now, the mechanism aimed at other people's coffers will one day turn on its own. He returned to the notebook with notes on the size of the debt, written out in words. There was a direct line between the courtyard's financial failure and the sudden fervor of the sermons. In the margins, he wrote, "Why such things should be recorded, because later legends will always choose a colorful story about a dirty secret, while a document will remind us that behind the facade there were barrels and millstones." Some would say that it was worth cleansing the world of temptation. But no inventory sheet knows the word temptation. It knows the words transfer, transfer, and sale. Meanwhile, the crowd was gaining a sense of completion. After the first seizures, it received an image of justice. Seals on the gates, strangers' horses under royal riders, a change of guard at the warehouses. The clerk noted how quickly the market buzz calmed down when visible action appeared, and how such calm helped the office to quietly compile tables. His craft did not require loud words. It required understanding that the political machine loves simple scenes and complex accounting results. He filed away one more thing: complaints from adult workers from the seized farms. They wrote that the new administration was delaying payments, demanding longer hours, and disrupting the mill's schedule. These complaints did not make it into the sermons. They lacked dirty appeal. But for the clerk, it was an important symptom. After the purification, life had not become cleaner, but poorer. This did not justify or accuse the order as such. It showed that the meaning of the action lay not in morality, but in the cash register. At the end of this section, he formulated one more, the last loop for today. Unified confessions not only triggered confiscation, but also shaped future memory. When, years later, someone writes a life of debauchery, they will find dozens of identical phrases and decide that they are evidence of the truth. They will not see the prison doctors with their dry lines, and they will not want to see the invoices for the transportation of barrels. The scribe left marks for this future reader. Myth sounds louder. Documents last longer. And in those future charters, where bans on repressive evidence will finally appear, it will be possible to hear not high morality, but the caution of people who know the price of identical words and coinciding clues. He opened the final folder where he had put everything that did not fit into the legend, and tried to see the whole mechanism. At the top lay a strip with the first conversations about indecent rituals. Below it, neat lines of standardized confessions. Further down, waybills for the removal of barrels and chests, and at the very bottom, drafts of new charters with dry precautions against repressive evidence. Between these layers walked the same adults: preachers, guards, scribes, accountants, administrators, prison doctors. None of them were mythical monsters or saints. Each did their part, and from these parts, a machine was born that found it easier to excite the crowd with dirt than to explain the cash deficit and debt schedules. He ran his finger over the inscriptions once more and realized that at the turn of the century, morality had become a currency with which to pay for the right to open other people's gates. In a separate pile lay letters in which prudent canonists tried to put the brakes on the machine. They reminded him that confessions obtained under pressure do not stand the test of time, that the uniformity of formulas is a sign of a matrix, not of revelation. In response, orders came in regarding the storage of confiscated items and the transfer of rights. This asymmetry was painfully simple. Theological caution required time, while economic necessity required warehouses right now. The clerk saw how a new habit crept into this gap, replacing the dispute over faith with a dispute over the sanitary purity of rituals, because sanitary panic and indecent images mobilize the public more quickly. Where one wanted to talk about coins with impurities and delays in paying garrisons, one talked about signs and rituals. Words were chosen not for their truth, but for their speed. He added rare protocols to the case in which individual judges allowed themselves to express doubts. They contained dry remarks about the discrepancy in dates, about the fact that identical formulas came from different prisons with a difference of one day, about the strange synchronicity of corrections in confessions. These sheets did not overturn the outcome, but they left traces of human caution in the text. Next to them lay complaints from workers at farms that had already been confiscated. The mills ran unevenly, the guards changed too often, the new administration took more than it promised and paid later. No one printed these complaints on leaflets for the square because they had no plot, only the tiresome truth that purification does not go well with order. In one of the packages, he found correspondence about future statutes for other military brotherhoods and pious communities. It explicitly prohibited the use of confessions obtained under physical coercion as evidence. It prescribed keeping double books of property and debts and storing copies in independent locations. It stipulated checks on protocol formulas so that they would not become a template for all cases. These precautions were not a victory of conscience over calculation. They were the fear of the machine itself, which understood that tomorrow it could find itself on the other side of the seal. The clerk noted in the margins, "It is precisely after major purges that the authorities learn to limit their own instruments, not out of mercy, but so that the tool does not devour its master." In his summary notebook, he drew a final line between myth and document. The myth claimed that the saints judged the debauched and saved the city from temptation. The document showed that confessions were made according to a template, and property was transferred according to invoices, that the crowd was warmed by dirty descriptions, and the treasury was warmed by the opportunity to close the hole, that prison doctors recorded exhaustion and fever in adult detainees, and these records of physical suffering did not reach the public, that the court, repeating the same words, worked like a machine cutting out the desired profile. The clerk did not draw any moral conclusions from this. He recorded the production norm. The pornography of accusations was not the goal, but the fuel, and that is precisely why it proved so resilient. He had to decide how to close the case. He wrote a brief note for the internal archive. He listed 5 stages in order: the explosion of rumors of indecency, the failure of the treasury, and the growing need for an entertaining excuse, the mass production of standardized confessions under pressure, the crowd's demand for purification, and the subsequent transfer of rights according to inventories and finally the appearance in the charters of future years of clauses prohibiting the use of planted evidence. He called this five-step ladder a conveyor belt, because adult performers stood on each rung, and each rung led to the next, until the chests changed hands. In the margins, he added a dry formula: income from moral anxiety in favor of the deficit treasury. In those same days, the city cooled down. Seals no longer surprised anyone, and the crowd, having received its purification, returned to its usual hardships: the salt tax, the lack of grain deliveries in bad weather, rumors of new court loans. Late leaflets with spicy episodes still circulated in the markets, but they were read out of habit. The scribe saw how the myth ended its work. It provided a spectacle, helped people get through their anxiety and hide the transfer of property, and then lost its appeal because the reckoning began behind the scenes. And then those very new statutes came into force, in which prohibitions were written without emotion, like a table of measurements: what to consider a crime, how to invalidate a confession, how to record the transfer of rights so that every step left a trace. From a human perspective, he had three options, none of which involved heroism or glory. The first was the decision of individual judges who, without overturning the verdict, nevertheless recorded their doubts and pointed out the uniformity of the formulas. Their caution became a small stone in the wall, thanks to which future charters acquired the language of prohibitions. The second was the decision of doctors and prison clerks, who stubbornly recorded in their books the consequences of pressure on adult detainees. Their dry pedantry gave posterity the opportunity to see the price of confessions without descriptions of the nature. The third was the decision of the clerk of the office himself, who did not limit himself to copying invoices, but collected rumors, orders, and inventories in one place. His spindle connected myth and document in such a way that the gap became visible even to those who were accustomed to believing the sheets with dirt. He extinguished the lamp, leaving a neatly bound folder on the table. The city drew a damp cold into the windows, and in this silence, a simple thought sounded clearly. The authorities, who need property, rarely argue about dogmas. They argue about visibility. The more disgraceful the ritual appears, the easier it is to open the lock. And if tomorrow the machine has a new need, it will again resort to the old words about filth and purification, because they have long since become an industrial tool. To counter this, beautiful sermons are not enough. We need boring texts, lines about the invalidity of confessions under duress, about double books of property, about keeping copies, about checking formulas. Boredom saves better than heat. And so his case ended, not with the victory of good over evil, but with the return of paper to its duties. He did not justify anyone or condemn them with myths. He showed the journey of words from the square to the warehouse and the path of chests to the treasury. He knew that the legend would outlive his notebook and continue to tell of filth and secret signs for a long time to come. But he left marks between the pages that anyone who could read columns would understand. Where the crowd screams in the left column and the signs on the gates change in the right. And if another clerk ever opens this folder, he will see that behind the pornography of accusations, there is always an accountant. And behind the purification of faith, there is a transport register. The outcome was not a celebration, but it became clear. The machine got what it deserved, and the city got new rules that prohibited it from operating without brakes. This was the only honest outcome, not loud or holy, but human, made up of small decisions that brought at least some limit back to the process. He returned to the cabinets where the books that had survived the purification were gathering dust, and began to note how the legend changed its skin and the paper changed owners. In one row lay the chronicles, where adult chroniclers relished the dirty details as if they had meaning. In another row lay collections of deeds with neat lines about the transfer of rights to bridges, crossings, water wheels, courtyards, and meadows. There was no dispute between them, because they did not speak the same language. The chronicles sold heat, the deeds reflected cold. He ran his finger over the deeds from the early 14th century, where royal officials assigned to the court what had yesterday been under the seals of the order, and then to other institutions that were allowed to take part of the property nominally. The same meaning always emerged on the last page. It is easier to pay for the court's expenses with other people's storerooms if the crowd is busy with dirty secrets. The city books contain traces of how this wealth was distributed. Mills on rivers needed repairs, dams needed reinforcement, bridges needed new planks. The new administration often failed to keep up because its main task was to quickly fill the treasury. The accounts showed entries for the sale of millstones, barrels, and horses. There were records of the leasing of tolls at crossings. Mercenaries received their delayed pay in installments, written off in words from the goods that had been sold off. Villages under the control of new people complained about disruptions in milling and water supply, a shortage of craftsmen, and the fact that once strict but stable taxes had become random. Nothing sacred was happening. Excessive interference in the short term brought quick money and slow decline. He filed these notes next to the seals and noted, "When the moral story ends, the debt story begins." The letters from cautious clerics who had weathered the storm struck a different note. They asked to separate the disciplinary from the dogmatic, so as not to burn with fire where it was enough to amend the charter. They recalled how standardized confessions obtained under pressure had destroyed trust in the court, and proposed two simple breaks for the future: a ban on considering such confessions sufficient, and a requirement for double accounting, so that any transfer of property would leave a mirror image. These letters did not undo what had already been done, but they explained where the later rules on repressive evidence had come from. He placed them under a title without pathos: the machine's fear of itself. Next came the economic details, quiet and persistent. At the state mint, where impurities had long been a problem, the process was only cleaned up after enough silver had been extracted from other people's chests to to provide a short respite. A few years later, as described in words, tax arrears and payment delays reappeared in the city books. The dirt had already been spent, and there was no peace. Against this backdrop, the legend of indecent rituals took on a life of its own and began to benefit others. Preachers found in it a convenient example for moralizing others, and pamphleteers found in it a commodity for the market. The meaning of the case dissolved like a stamp on a damp door, but the accountants in the office remembered where the barrels had disappeared to. He leafed through the minutes of later reviews, when individual adult judges tried to restore some credibility to the procedure. They asked to check dates, compare formulas, compare handwriting, and record where identical words were written under identical pressure. Sometimes, such reviews ended with restrained remarks, acknowledging that the unification of confessions undermined the power of the sentence. These remarks did not return property, but they shaped the language of future prohibitions, which in charters for other communities finally called repressive evidence what it was, a tool, not the truth. He noted, the system did not repent. The system protected itself from its own convenience. In some cities, books of fines appeared, where the organizers of crowds were recorded, if they called for cleansing with violence. They did not talk about faith, they talked about order. If cleansing involves looting shops and barns, it is not the shops and barns that should pay. Such books became an unexpected mirror in which moral words left a monetary trace. They were rarely read because no one likes to see righteous anger turn into a line of penalty imposed. The clerk placed one such book next to the brochures where the filth was described with zeal and drew a line. The longer the descriptions for the crowd, the shorter the lines about other people's losses. He came across a report on the fate of people who had been at the helm of farms and workshops before the confiscations. Adult managers, water and grain specialists, horse and iron masters. Some of them went to other homes, some disappeared into poverty, and some ended up in prison. For minor reasons, because they knew too much about warehouses and keys. This was not a tragedy worthy of song. It was an everyday loss of expertise that cost cities dearly. The new administration was more willing to hire loyalists than skilled workers. A few years later, the same books recorded the costs of inviting foreign craftsmen to repair dams and wheels. The human cost of purification was included in the estimates. He returned to the familiar three-column scheme: rumors, orders, inventories, and added a fourth column: consequences. It contained lines about the decline in mill output, delays in grinding, rising ferry costs, disputes between townspeople and new collectors, and the village's longing for the old order, harsh but understandable. There was no place here for dirty details, only a dull weariness where people paid twice. First with their curiosity about rumors, then with their wallets to the new collector. He underlined this column with a bold line and added, "Legend eats today's bread." In the large monastery archives, he found correspondence with doctors, in which they cautiously complained that after the indecencies were blown out of proportion, adult patients in the city began to suffer from frequent bouts of fear and insomnia. The sheets did not describe executions, but a dull background of anxiety. At night, it seemed that someone was knocking on the door. During the day, it seemed that someone was following you. The week dragged on like cold water. This information did not embellish anyone's agenda. It was put in the bottom boxes. But for the clerk, they became the last missing mark. The pornography of accusations feeds not only the treasury, but also new neuroses. Public dirt becomes everyday anxiety, a long whisper behind the wall from which another market grows, a market for printed leaflets, doctors, preachers, and guards. He tried to imagine how a later reader would search for the truth. A later reader would find chronicles with fiery paragraphs and set aside monotonous protocols. A later reader would focus on images because they are easier than sums expressed in words. To prevent this from happening, he dictated a brief memo for the archive. If dirty episodes are repeated in a formula in a document, look for a financial inventory under them. If invoices follow purification, remember that locks are changed, not souls. If years later, bans on repressive evidence appear, know that they were carved out not by an angel, but by fear of one's own instrument. This memo was not for the crowd, but for the future scribe, who would one day find himself back at the gray cloth table and find someone else's chests on it. On the last page, he returned to the beginning, where denunciations, lists of property, and a formula for caring for the faith lay on an oak board. Now this trio looked different. Denunciations became part of the old theater. Lists of property became part of accounting, and the formula became part of rhetoric. The only people who remained alive in this spectacle were the adult guards who affixed the seals, the adult doctors who recorded the price of confessions, the adult scribes who added up the columns, the adult judges who sometimes left doubts in the margins. Their caution formed the only useful memory, not the kind that shouts in the square, nor the kind that is sold at the fair, but the kind that provides a tool, a ban on confessions obtained by violence, the requirement for double books, the obligation to keep copies in places beyond the reach of current profit. The city outside the window was as noisy as it was every year. Blackened spears on guard, wet cobblestones smelling of cesspools, arguments about salt, haggling over the price of beans. The machine changed its oil and drove on. It would need words about evil again, because they were quick and cheap. But now, there was a neat folder with labels on the margins in the closet. These labels could be used to stop conversations that were too fond of dirty details and redirect attention to columns and invoices. Where myth demands shouting, documents demand accounting. Where the crowd wants fire, paper asks for stamps and records. And if tomorrow new sheets with indecencies appear on the table, someone will already know where to look for their shadow. In lists of debts, in the routes of convoys, in drafts of future statutes, where human decisions are transformed into boring safety precautions against their own power. He closed the folder and placed it in the cabinet, between the cases on duties and the cases on bridges. No bells, No fanfare, just the click of wood. The denouement became as simple as a notarial formula. Myth says that saints judged debauchees. The document shows that the state transferred rights under the cover of filth, and then, fearing its own cunning, wrote prohibitions on repressive evidence into the statutes. The outcome does not make the world pure, but it makes it clearer. The machine can continue to feed on the excited crowd, but the people inside the machine are capable of leaving traces that will make it possible to stop it sooner next time. This was the only honest hope, not for a miracle, but for neat handwriting, for a doctor's dry remark, for a judge's signature, for an estimate where the words are written out in full, without numbers, and therefore each line can be heard as a human decision.